what do you think is the number one conversation mistake that people make?
Whenever they get into the conversation, particularly when they're having to push a particular point or view or issue, is that what they say has to be accepted. Whenever I say something, well, we just kind of expect the other person to take it. And when it comes to ideas, maybe in the boardroom, maybe late at night with your spouse in the living room, we just naturally assume that our idea is the best idea and our thought is the best thought. And we are just naturally built to defend against anything else that anybody says ever. So let's say we're in a boardroom, somebody throws out an idea. If it doesn't have every hole plugged and it's not tied with a bow, we have a very natural default to go, oh, that's a dumb idea. That's a terrible idea. That's stupid. Or why would you even say that? When we think that what we say is just a gift from the heavens and they should naturally say yes to it. So it's this idea of trying to win the argument, win the conversation, have what you say be the only thing that could ever be heard in the conversation.
Right. And so instead of like somebody going into an argument to win, like what do you think the goal should actually be?
Yeah, what I'd like to say is you need to see arguments as not something to win, but something to unravel. When you see arguments as knots in the conversation, it turns it visual almost. So I like to kind of see it. You fish at all. I like to fish down here in Texas. If you have an open face reel, which means the spool is right up at the front and you have a backlash and it's just a bird's nest of a thing and you're having to like undo it all. It's kind of like that. When you just continue to pull your way and I'm pulling my way and you're going, no, you need to go with my point of view. And I'm saying, no, you need to go with my point of view. It tightens it. It doesn't unravel it. It doesn't loosen it. So when you start to begin at the loose ends, and sometimes I might even say in the conversation, okay, help me unravel this knot. So one, I'm saying, help me, which people like to be helpful. Two, I'm saying this knot, meaning the thing that we're having to struggle with right now, let's talk about that. What do you see from your side? What do I see from my side? Rather than continuing to try to push my point, just make it worse.
At the end of the day, people can get incredibly defensive in an argument. This is like something you talk about it in your book. How can people avoid like getting defensive in an argument with somebody when things are super emotional?
Well, whenever things are emotional, that's the first problem right there is when you are letting your emotions take the steering wheel, it's really hard to engage your analytical side, that logical side. The side says, let me be curious about this. Who's the person behind the words? What's really happening right here? Because every time you're in an argument, somebody's having a conversation in their head that you weren't invited to. Like they know things that they have in their life, their own triggers, their own experience, their own trauma that you may only be seeing the tip of the iceberg on. And so when you say that one comment that they think is so incredibly hurtful and you're going, what are you talking about? All I said was X. A lot of that speaks to things that you can't see. So when you want to make sure that let's start with you not trying to be defensive. It's this mindset that you need to just drop it. We like to get defensive because we take things personally. We find ways to take what they said as a personal affront, or maybe it's they are saying something in a way that says you are undermining my authority, my autonomy, my control. And when you can just tell yourself to just drop it and try and get curious of what's happening on the other side, it's going to make things a whole lot easier. Now, where you also win is, I like how I said win, where you also find success is by keeping the other person from getting defensive. So that's one of the biggest strengths that you can do is keep the other person from getting defensive. And what I teach is that when you use phrases that make them feel acknowledged at the same time without being directly confrontational, it's going to go a whole lot better for you. So if you and I are in a conversation, Doug, and you're starting to push your point, and if I just said, no, that's dumb, I don't agree with that, that's stupid, point aside, you're going to take that personally and go, are you calling me an idiot? Like, what do you know what I know? Who are you to tell me what I should believe? It makes things worse. But if you could just say, I agree. Doesn't mean that you have to agree with what they're talking about. But if you were to say, I agree that's worth talking about. I agree somebody needs to look into that. I agree that's important. All they hear is, I agree. And they withdraw, getting defensive. Or you could say something like, well, that's helpful to know. That's helpful. That's helpful to know. People love to be helpful. Or you tell them what you've learned. After listening, Doug, what I've learned is this is really important to you. And so I want to make sure we keep talking about it. So all of a sudden you're just going to go, oh, okay, thank you. You made me feel acknowledged. You made me feel like what I said was not dumb. It was not something to throw pie back in my face. So those are just little ways you can try and de-escalate the defensiveness that is so natural to every one of us.
And I think what also can happen is the other person might naturally just get defensive, not, I don't want to say on accident, but you could do all the right things and they still will get defensive because they feel like you're hurting them, or they feel attacked by you bringing something up that maybe bothers you about the situation. How can you maintain control of yourself in the conversation when the other person begins to act a little irrational?
The number one thing you can do to make sure that you say things with control, which is step one of what I teach in my book, The Next Conversation, is you say it with control. And that means you have to put your breath as the first word that you say. So when you put breath, before you even say anything else, you think of it as an actual word that you're putting in first. So you're starting with your breath. It keeps the emotions from getting flooded, no matter how unreasonable this other person is being, how emotional and responsive they are being. Reactionary is the better word. Using your breath keeps you more in control. Now, if you and I are in an argument and all of a sudden I start raising my voice and I start yelling at you, and are you kidding me? Versus taking a breath and saying, okay, keep talking. Tell me more. Well, which one sounds more in control? Which one says I'm grasping for control? The other one says I am in control. Whenever you can put breath as the first word that you say, you naturally are in control because you have that moment before the argument really even begins, before you go into your ignition mode in this and start getting into the hard fight or flight. You are making sure that you are keeping your analytical side engaged. So really the tip that anybody can do is making breath be the first word that you say. It's going to make it a whole lot better. Like if you were to ask me, hey, Jefferson, how was your day? And immediately I said, it was good. It was good. It was fine. It was a good day. Versus you just ask me, hey, how was your day? And I took a breath and it was good. It was a good day. Like, which one sounds like you actually thought about the question? Which one makes you feel like you acknowledged what you said and you found it valuable? Anytime you can use your breath and slow down your words, slow down the response, you always look more in control.
Part of being in control of the conversation also stems from having a level of confidence in yourself to be able to talk about what it is that you're talking about. How can people get better at appearing and becoming confident during conversations?
So rule 2 of my book is say it with confidence. And the way that I like to implement this into my clients and to people that follow my content is you have to find an assertive voice. People feel like confidence is something they need to have before they have the conversation. Like, I'm working up the confidence to say this. That's wrong. It's the opposite. Confidence is the outcome. Confidence is what you get after you do the assertive thing. So I teach confidence is as assertive does. So when you can use your assertive voice, that is what is going to give you the pieces of confidence that will continue to just be in a loop. The more assertive things you say, the more confident you feel. The more confident you feel, the easier it is to be assertive. And it is a sense that is within you of, I know where I am. So once you feel more in control, you automatically sound and feel more confident. A quick little trick that I use, aside from one of the ways we could talk about assertive voice, is just using the word confident. Just using the word confident naturally makes you appear and sound and feel more confident. Like if I'm interviewing for you and you ask me a question, I could say, if I said, no, I believe I could really bring some value to this team, versus I'm confident I can bring some value to this team. All of a sudden, the other person, you're going to get your notepad and go, man, this person sounds confident. And just using that word attributes that quality to you, not only to the other person, but also to yourself, which is incredibly important.
I want to talk about how to get better at speaking in an assertive way. You and I touched on this and covered this in our first conversation, and I catch myself sometimes like fluffing up like an email, like, hey, hope all is well. Just instead of just getting to the point. I think you and I talked about this because I think sometimes my conscious is like, oh, are they going to think that I'm not caring or empathetic? And then many people do this. So talk a bit about like why that doesn't matter as much and how to become more assertive.
It does matter. It's not about using more words. It's about using the right words. Where people get bogged down is they feel like if they say more things, they will be more believable, be more liked. It will reap additional, even more benefits. But it's actually just the opposite. If you were to say to me, invite me somewhere, and all of a sudden I start a very long text, like, hey, Doug, thank you so much for inviting me. Like, I've just been so busy lately, and, I need to go water my cat and feed my house and do all these things. And I need to, and I've just been so overwhelmed. The more you say, the less believable you sound, the more fluff that you add into it. It's this concept of the more words it takes to tell the truth, the more it sounds like a lie. So when you are responding in emails, let's just put it in written correspondence. You're typing, you're texting, whatever. There's the tendency to give more, but nobody wants to read a long paragraph. As soon as you get that paragraph text, you go, oh gosh, and you miss a lot of the key points. Same thing with a long email. There's nothing worse than a long email. All you do is you gave me a chore. That's what you gave me. You didn't give me an email. You gave me a chore for me to dissect exactly what you're trying to say. The problem we run into is we just use a lot of fluff. We use a lot of adverbs. I have a friend who he almost always starts a sentence with, so basically, or so essentially. That's just fluff. That doesn't mean anything. Using words like just, so, essentially, literally, basically, obviously, clearly, all these things that mean nothing. Like you don't need them. You just remove them from your sentences. There's a difference in how it sounds. If I were to email you, hey, just want to check in, versus I wanted to check in. Like just removing that word just makes it less hesitant, less like you're not sure of yourself and you don't want to intrude. It's leaning into your conversation, leading into your words. So the best rule is to always say less. If people have questions, they will ask you. You want to make sure that you are being a well of information, not a waterfall of it.
And when it comes to maybe texting with your significant other or somebody that you're dating, I would imagine you have to be careful with how direct you are, because if somebody's like, how's your day? And you're like, it's great, and you don't say anything else, your perception might be like, yeah, I'm just being honest and that's what it is. How does it differ when you're communicating with somebody that you love?
Yeah, well, I mean, it could be not just people you love, but really anyone. I'm not saying be short. There's a difference between being short and saying less. Being short is it's great, good, okay, cool. Like typical dad texts. This is how my dad texts. Like I could text him all some cool things that are happening and I'll just get back cool. You know what I mean? Like there are ways that if I were to respond to my wife and just go K, like I might as well have just signed a death warrant. Like it's not going to do any good. So there is a difference when I say being short versus being concise. And if you want to say, it's been an awesome day, thank you, versus it's a little bit different because in personal relationships, we want to know more. I'd say there's a difference most of the time between men and women of who want to know all the things and how you're feeling about all the things versus us guys, bros, if you're going to text me, our text thread's going to be pretty short and pretty boring, but that doesn't mean that we're not tight and we're not friends and we're not still great on the same page. It's very different. I find most of our defaults. But when it comes to personal communication, it is best policy to be direct and be open and be honest rather than beginning with all of the fluff. I don't mean don't tell them how you're feeling. You don't need to, that's wonderful. That's necessary. My biggest things, particularly in the workplace, is you want to be very careful of over explaining and oversharing, that's when you can get into trouble.
And so when it comes to remaining assertive and having respect for yourself and gaining respect from other people, I think what can happen is you send that assertive email or text to a boss, a colleague, etc., and their response isn't what you thought it would be. And sometimes people end up maybe wanting to give a little bit more so they can, appease that person. How can people maintain assertiveness throughout correspondence to be able to maintain a level of respect?
Yeah, let's put it in a context. Do some type of scenario. Because it changes, between if it's a superior, somebody who's a supervisor above you, or somebody who's below you. So what kind of scenario do you want to take?
I would say the common thing, let's just say amongst friends or something.
Yeah. And what are we talking about? I want to make sure, because if you want to be assertive in that conversation among friends, it's a little bit more difficult. Like, there are people who are work friends, like it's just people that but you necessarily wouldn't want to, go hang out with them after work, but you're cool and your buddies during the office hours. And there are other people that are genuinely, your people, your tribe, your village.
I would say the people that are your tribe, your village, like you're trying to communicate maybe something that bothers you about that, or you're trying to bring up something and you're assertive about it, and they kind of come back and they get maybe defensive or say you're wrong, and then you're still trying to maintain your boundary without caving, essentially.
Yeah. So a lot of the times what you can do is you give them the permission to disagree. You're giving them the permission to have another opinion. So if you respond with, it's okay to disagree, or you can disagree with me, like that's what they need. They're not expecting that, first of all. But when you can use that to your advantage and say, yeah, it's cool. You can have a different opinion. I'm letting you know how I feel. I'm not trying to control how you feel. I'm just telling you what is going to be right for me. So like my dad would say this whenever I would let's say there's something that was happening that I didn't like, and he made a decision on something that I couldn't go somewhere. I couldn't, whatever my curfew was, and I was voicing my disapproval. He would always say, well, you don't have to like it. You just need to understand it. Like that was the key. And of course, as a kid, I hated that, but now I see the wisdom in it, because he was allowing me the space to connect with him and disagree, to say, oh, you don't have to like it. Hey, you don't have to like it, but you just need to understand it. And I think that's where we get lost sometimes, is this idea of connecting with the other person. Connection. It's a circuit. It's like a battery. You have to have the positive and the negative. I can connect with you and still be upset with you. I can still disagree with you. Like, connection doesn't mean that I approve or I agree and that we're a Hallmark movie. Connection is just as important in the negative and the hard and in the difficult.
Well, I think what happens in conversations, in arguments, like when you're trying to, raise your point to somebody who you disagree, is in order for you to feel like validated, I think it has to come from the other person, right? People are like, I'm not going to feel better until that person like gets me. Like, how can people, like, let's just say you and I are having a conversation and I'm telling you, like, I didn't like the way that you treated me or spoke to me, like last week when we were out, or when we were at some event or something. And you're like, I see things differently. And I'm like, well, and I'm trying to keep hammering home the point. Like, how could I get to a place where I feel like my point is known to you without you being like, you're right?
So use the phrase, I can see. Begin your sentence with, I can see. I can see how it can make you feel that way. I can see how that would impact you. I can see how that would upset you. And when you say that, you are automatically acknowledging that, hey, what you're seeing it's inaccurate. It's an accurate description from your point of view. I can see that. When, instead of just going, that's not true. That's not what I said. That didn't happen. You're never going to get them to your side of the court that way. But when you can begin with, I can see that. I can see how you'd say that. It's better than I understand or I get it, because one says, I see things from your view. I'm going over to where you are, standing in your shoes and looking at what you're looking at. The other says, I understand the point that you're making. Very different. one says, I have been there with you and I'm looking at it your way, I can see how you feel that way. And that feels like you're justifying, they're justified, they're acknowledged, they feel heard and understood, and it's going to calm them down. They're not going to be nearly as offensive. One thing that I also like to teach is when there's a disagreement over what you said, that's not what I said. If you ask the other person, instead of saying, that's not what I said, you ask the question, what did you hear? That opens it up to their perspective, because I could say something and somebody can regurgitate it back and you go, what planet are we on? Were we in the same room when this happened? That's not what I said at all. That's not how I said that. What are you talking about? Say a relationship with a spouse, the other spouse might go, yeah, you just said, and they trying to imitate you in a very sarcastic tone. And you're like, that's not what I said at all. It's because you are only trying to push what you've said rather than giving attention to what they heard, because what they'll hear is most often very different.
And sometimes in relationships, what happens is patterns can kind of happen, and, people make mistakes and they say things they don't necessarily mean. And then that tends to bother the other person. How can somebody bring up something that's bothering them in a relationship that allows them to feel heard, get their point across, but can help protect themselves from that other person getting defensive?
Anytime you're having to have a difficult conversation like this, I like to teach about frames. So this is in my rule number 3, say it to connect. And we talk about frames in the book, and it lays out how to have a difficult conversation, almost like a formula that works for any topic. Number 1, you tell them what you want to talk about. 2, you tell them how you want to feel after that conversation. And 3, you get their buy-in into that frame. So let's say in your scenario, you need to bring up something that bothers you. So we could say from the beginning, instead of all this fluff, let's do real quick how it could go wrong. If you go, hey, so remember when you did X and we said this, and the other person's going, where are you going? What are you talking about? What's happening here? And the anxiety builds, the defensiveness builds. And you're like, can you just get to the point, please? And all they're feeling is you're dismissing, you're not caring, you don't want to talk about this, which they sense it spirals down from there. Instead of all the fluff, beginning with that small talk, if you begin with, I like to talk with you about something that bothers me, or that's been bothering me. That's 1. So you got their attention. You're not waiting to the very end to tell them that it bothers you. 2, and I don't want you to try and fix it. I just want to feel heard on this. That's number 2. You're telling them how you want the conversation to end. So it could be as simple as, I'm not asking you to fix this. I'm not asking for us to do anything with it. I just need to voice it for me to process it. You see how it's a much better, now I know what you're wanting. Now I'm not trying to step in and fix it every single way. Last part 3 is getting their buy into the frame. That's as easy as saying, does that sound good? Can we do that? Is that all right? And they will say yes. They're going to say yes. And once they do, you kind of have this invisible contract of, now we know what to talk about. Now we know we're going to be talking about something that they know bothers you. 2, they know they don't need to fix it. They're not trying to solve anything. You just want to be heard. Or maybe you want to say, and I want to say this and explain this so we can talk about some steps to where I'm not going to feel this way, or this isn't going to happen again. That's where you're actually having a goal for the conversation. That now they know where you're going in the conversation, and it's going to improve it every time.
And what about you have the right frame, like you just said, you talk about something that's bothering you, and then it happens again, which is normal. I think in a relationship, people aren't perfect. People don't change overnight. How can you bring that up in a way that is healthy? Because I think what tends to happen is people are like, I told you about this. You said you would do this, or why aren't you changing? You're not listening to me. You're not hearing me. How can people convey that without people shutting down?
Well, as soon as you start throwing the yous, you always do this. You never listen. You always, and it's going to automatically put up the spikes, put up the moat and the drawbridge, and forget about it. I would suggest using another frame. You're just going to tweak how you begin it. So if I like to talk to you about some repeated behavior that's really concerning to me. I like to talk about a pattern that I'm seeing that it frankly scares me. And I want to talk about it or I want to walk away from this conversation feeling like there's going to be some change, because if there's not, that causes a problem. Can we talk about that? Like, that's a much healthier way to discuss it, because you're telling them, I'm seeing a pattern. It's important to me. And the reason why it's important to me is because it is going to be determinative of where we are in the future.
When it comes to handling conflict, which we're talking about now, we're talking about having difficult conversations. We've talked about like defensiveness and stuff. Do you think there's any way to, I don't want to say prevent conflict, because conflict's going to happen in life, but to mitigate it specifically like in relationships? Like, do you propose like scheduling time to connect about things that are bothering you, or do you just propose like waiting until something happens?
I feel comfortable first with the idea that conflict should be welcomed. I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean good conflict. Everything of how you got to where you are in life is because some sort of conflict. You broke up with that one spouse or one, relationship that has led you to the next one. You left one job because you found another one. The whole way we are in our laws and the legal system and everything become out of conflict. Case law in my world, like how we have case law, comes from facts of cases that happened that were conflicts that generated the law. So conflict can be very much a stimulus for good. Say, okay, do you want conflict in relationships? How do you minimize that? Well, I understand. Let's start with the premise that conflict can be inherently good, because if you want deeper relationships, then you have to have a deepened tolerance for difficult conversations. If you've only had surface level conversations with somebody, well, I'll show you a surface level relationship. You need to have the deep ones, the ones that you really get to go deep with somebody, because that's how you get to know them. When you come out on the other side of something very difficult, bonds are made. You feel stronger. You feel like you know the real person. It's like in the military, when they have to go through elements of just war and combat. I mean, they come out on the other side inseparable. It is, you have to go through the difficult. So there has to be, number one, a willingness to see conflict as not as a zero-sum game, but as something that we can work through together. Two is not sweating the small stuff. If you want to have a fight over every little thing, and by the way, in relationships, I feel like most fights are about the small stuff. Like the worst fights happen over the dumbest little things. And it just happened to be at the wrong time where you decide to have this conversation. When you're tired, they're tired, somebody hasn't eaten, so you're a little bit grumpy, and you're like, you know what? Let's go. Let's just have this out right now. Come on, you want to talk? And it's not going to go well, because we sweat over the little things. And three is, it's okay to have conflict. It can be a healthy thing, hard to minimize it because we're natural people, which are normal. It is understanding of where it's going to go. If you know the goal of the conversation, rather than, again, we said win, lose, and you just see that as, let's talk about this in perspectives, it's informing you about the data behind the other person. So see it as a vessel for good in your life.
What's the most effective way to not sweat the small stuff, something that's so difficult to do?
You have to have this mindset of grace, this mindset of giving benefits of the doubt. That they didn't mean it personally, that they don't want to ruin your life, that inherently people want to be good and kind and understood, that even when somebody is yelling at you, you see it as a threat to their nervous system that they're experiencing in that moment, that something is threatening their nervous system. And you have to get curious enough to find out what is triggering in this moment. We talked about they're having a conversation you weren't invited to. That happens with everybody. When they escalate, maybe you're in a meeting and all of a sudden there's a guy who just puffs up and gets so mad. It's really the insecurity, the little person who's always had the chip on the shoulder that's yelling right in that moment. So often it is just the hearing of their tone and their voice are bids for connection, that they want to be understood. They just don't know how to voice it. How do you sweat? How do you not sweat the small stuff? you give a lot of grace in the conversation and understanding what are you going to make. My dad would say, don't make that your Alamo. Like here in Texas history, is that going to be the hill that you die on? Is that really going to be the most important thing to you right now? Usually if you ask that question, like, is this really that important to you? Most often it's not. Oh, you want to move the couch 2 inches? Is that really going to be what you're going to put your flag in the ground on? So it's more of a relationship and conversation with yourself rather than the other person when it comes to the small stuff.
What about dealing with like criticism or when somebody like pokes at you? How can people get better at that without reacting super quickly?
Yeah, you mean like giving criticism or when somebody's giving criticism to you?
When you're on the receiving end of it.
I like the advice of don't take criticism from someone you wouldn't take advice from. And I would take that even further of rather than trying to butt up against it and disagree and okay, thanks, like this sarcastic attitude, you never really know how the other person is trying to mean it or intend it, even if it comes out poorly. Best course of action is just to have a sense of gratitude. Thank you for telling me. Thank you for that. Even if you disagree with it. Because it is, if you don't want to get yourself in an argument with somebody that you would not take advice from. So if you're not going to follow their criticism, if you're not going to take their criticism because you don't respect them, they're not that important to you, they don't mean something in your life, then why in the world would you have an argument with them to make that worse? You just need to say thank you and move on with it. I mean, it's one of those things of like not sweating the small stuff. You don't like what I did? Okay, thanks. Thanks for that heads up. Thanks for the feedback. It's really just kind of water off a duck's back.
Speaking of not engaging with people that you don't admire or like, what do you think are things that people do in conversation and communication that immediately like turn people off?
Talk about themselves. Let's say I want to share something cool about my day. Or I'll hear this sometimes when somebody says, hey, I'm thinking of starting a new business. And the other person goes, oh, really? What? Oh, that's cool. I just sold mine in my third business for 2.1. I was texting Mark Cuban the other day. You know Mark, right? I mean, he's a great guy. Anyway, and you start to like just sit on them. Like they have a bright light and you have the ability to glow them up even more. Instead of just going, oh, that's awesome. What kind of business? What are you excited about? What's happening? And asking questions, you want to say, I'm going to push you out of the way so all the spotlight still falls on me. People will, when they one-up you, like even when they're friends, even when people that you love, we still have a way of, they're sharing good news. We need to be like, oh yeah, I did that the other day. And you don't ask anything about their experience. You don't get their thoughts. It's as simple as just going, oh, that's great. What's your favorite part? Like just one question tells the other person, I value what you said. I find it interesting. And what you said has meaning to me, rather than immediately going, oh yeah, that's cool. Yeah. So when I did that, like, oh, you went skydiving? That's cool. When I was going like on my second trip, I just let me talk about myself. That's probably one of the most unintentional, because what you're trying to do is relate to them. You try to say something that's, we're on the same level, but what happens in that moment is you're trying to steal their thunder. Just, hey, move aside. Let me talk about me. And the other person goes, oh, okay, great. Well, thanks for this conversation. I'm so glad I said something so you could talk about yourself. All you need to do is just really ask one question, and then you can share, or you can even ask for permission. I mean, you care if I share my skydiving story? And they're like, oh yeah, let's hear it. Now they want to hear about it because you've given them the runway to have the spotlight, and now they can share it.
This episode is brought to you by Timeline Nutrition. Listen, my main goals for the remainder of the year revolve around health and vitality. After hearing about Timeline Nutrition from several of my friends in the health industry, I decided to give their flagship product, MitoPure, a try. MitoPure contains urolithin A, which is a powerful postbiotic that can be challenging to get from your diet. As you know, science has been a big focus on the podcast, so I was really impressed that Timeline has done 10 years of research to bring this product to market. I've been taking their berry powder for over a month now, and have already noticed a bit of a difference in the gym. Some of the long-term benefits I'm hoping to achieve from taking it include improved energy, muscle strength, and endurance, which are right in line with my goals. So I highly recommend you check out Timeline Nutrition, and they are now offering 10% off your first order of MitoPure. So just go to timeline.com/Doug to get 10% off your first order of MitoPure. That's TIMELINE.com/Doug. Now back to the show.
Yeah, I think the fastest way to like really charm somebody or make them feel valued is when they're sharing something, to listen to them and not butt in. And that's been a mistake I've made over the years, because I think, like you said, I'm relating to them. I'm not drilling them with questions. I don't want to seem like I'm interrogating them. Like, what's the bridge for that, so that you're not just like, if you're in like a relationship with somebody or you're with a family member, you're not just like asking one question and the conversation's over. You're trying to actually like be engaged. Like, how can people ask questions in a conversation without them feeling like they're in an interview?
Open-ended questions that open them up. And this is what I mean. So if you were sharing something with me and you said, hey, I just went to the racetrack this weekend. I don't know. I've never been to a racetrack. I don't know why I chose that, but let's say that's what it was. And I responded, oh, the one in town, right? And like, yeah, the one in town. Oh yeah. Did you go to the VIP area in the back there? You just check that out. And like, you're asking questions that are yes or no. And at the same time, trying to hint at them that I've already done that. I've done something way cooler. That's annoying. The bridge to that is open-ended questions. These are questions that begin with what or how or where. So if you just ask, oh, that's cool. When did you go? What was your favorite part? What did you like about it? Like, you ask things that are going to get them to talk more about their experience. Or one thing to do, even in like small talk, is get them to talk about what has led them to the present moment. So if you were to just ask, how did you come to that? Where did you learn that from? Like, that kind of information, they love to talk about themselves. They love to talk about how they know all the things. So when you can poke into that, rather than trying to prove them wrong or what you have is way cooler, that's a much better option.
Yeah, totally. What do you think is like the biggest like conversation skill, communication skill that people like need to learn? Is it assertiveness? Is it how to control the conversation? Is it how to control their emotions? Like, what do you think it is?
Emotional intelligence. And what I mean by that, I think it can sometimes be a little bit of a woo-woo word, or word that some people have confusion over, and I get that. To me, it is your ability to read the emotions in others and to read the emotions of yourself in real time. When you can detach from an important conversation and you can almost see it happening as if you're sitting in the stands, like you're sitting in the audience with your popcorn and you're watching the dynamic between the two of you. If you have the ability to look at, okay, I can see how they're reacting, they're upset, and I'm looking how I'm reacting, I can tell I'm upset. You have a lot more emotional bandwidth to be able to accept all of the feelings rather than disagree with them and trying to push your emotions onto them, because people mirror each other. If I was mad right now and start talking to you mad, without you even thinking about it, your face is going to start to look kind of mad. If somebody's just all of a sudden frantic, it naturally makes you frantic. So we like to mirror each other's energies. So whenever you can be emotionally intelligent and have this calm energy about you, I think that is one of the most overlooked skills and power moves in communication, is the calm energy.
How can people get better at that?
Well, one we talked about was your breath. Two is using the phrase, I can tell. So if I'm starting to get defensive and we're getting in an argument and I say, I can tell I'm getting defensive. Like, that's not weak. That is a strength. That is telling the other person, I'm very aware. I'm emotionally aware and self-aware of how I'm feeling, rather than me just acting out on that defensiveness and saying, nuh-uh, that's not true. That is wearing the shirt of defensiveness. That is being defensive, rather than just saying, I can tell that's making me defensive. I'm not ready for this conversation right now, or I'm going to ignore that point. I'm not going to address that point. Like that is emotional intelligence right there of going, I'm just going to scoot around this because I know that's not going to serve me. That's not going to get anywhere for us. See, I know where I'm going in the conversation. I can tell you don't. Let me show you where to go. And so whenever you have that really calm energy, people are looking for anchors. They're looking for stability in communication. When you're talking with somebody who's frantic and all over the place and emotional and want to talk in a circle, I mean, it's draining. It's emotionally draining where you get out of that conversation and you're like, oh my gosh, I can't, I need a vacation. I need a break. I need a few hours to myself. But when you can be an anchor in that conversation and say, oh, you said that crazy thing, that unreasonable thing, that thing that hurt. And I'm showing you it did not hurt me because what I heard is somebody who's feeling insecure right now, who's feeling defensive or just tired or hungry, like, and not taking it personally. That's true strength. And that's what people are looking for in communication, those kind of people.
And I think what's happened is over the years, there's been like a narrative shared by certain people that say, if you share your emotions, you're seen as weak and insecure, like you should, not show your cards. But obviously the opposite was true. You're seen as weak and insecure if you can't own the fact that you're getting emotionally charged, or that you're not showing up 100% in the conversation.
I mean, I just saw a podcast episode of like Simon Sinek and Jocko. Like, and Jocko's thing was like the number one key is vulnerability. Like, if he can be vulnerable, Lord knows you can. Like, it is this idea of, I know his is radical ownership. That means also taking ownership of your part in the conversation, taking ownership of your emotions in the conversation. And that can sound like, as soon as you say something that's hurtful, saying that was unhelpful, that was unfair, I shouldn't have said that. That's ownership. Same thing of yourself. And you can say, I can tell I'm getting defensive, or I can tell I'm not ready for this conversation. I can tell that I'm getting upset. Like, that's also taking ownership of yourself in that communication. So it works both ways. To say that owning your emotions or acknowledging your emotions is weak, those are people that are not emotionally intelligent. Those are people that are in the echo chamber and, probably on their own wavelength where nobody else is listening.
Yeah, I know. And it's really sad because I wish that narrative wasn't out there, because as we both know, like the gateway to connection, as you talk about, is, just being vulnerable and owning your emotions and being confident with the way that you're feeling. And speaking of that, well, did I just use a filler word? Sorry.
No, we're great. We're great.
What's been something you've had to work on personally in your communication skills, either with your wife or with your kids, your family?
I struggle as much as anybody. I find that one thing that I can do sometimes is just the natural instinct of getting defensive, because it is part of our biology. Somebody disagrees with my opinion, I want to show them how wrong they are. If somebody says something ugly, your natural reaction is to let me send the zinger. Let me concoct something so poetic that you're not going to get it right now. You're going to get it 3 days from now, because what I'm about to zing right in your face is going to live in your head rent free. Like, that's the kind of thing that everybody has right at the outset of trying to calm yourself and make sure that you're not getting flooded or doing something that's going to hurt. I also I really do a lot of work on what we just talked about, owning my own emotions. I'm an internal processor. So my wife is an external processor, very external. So she wants to talk about all the things at all the time. And that's how she explains her reasoning and thoughts. She likes to talk out loud. I like to keep it all in. And I sometimes don't really even like to talk about emotions. Sometimes if I'm trying to be really efficient, emotions, I feel like they drag me down. I feel like they're inconvenience sometimes. And that's just me being me. That's just how I operate. And so understanding to have the acceptance of all emotions and not having to agree with their emotion is something that everybody can work on, including myself.
You've referenced your dad a lot in the podcast. You dedicated your book to them. I think you said to my parents who prayed over me or something to that effect. You just had your parents on your podcast, first guest. What was that experience like, given everything that you've learned from them?
Oh man, have them on the podcast. I was just really trying to like hold it together. There were so many moments where my dad tears up. Now that he's a grandfather, he like tears up all the time. And then of course I feel that emotion in the room. I'm one of those where if I see somebody crying in a movie, I probably cry in the movie. Like I can't watch scary things. I can't. It's somebody has an awkward moment in a movie. Oh, I feel so awkward. And so I sometimes will read that, and I felt that a lot from my dad. And it was different talking to your parents. Like all of a sudden I feel like I'm a kid. So I don't talk the same. I talk like I'm in the living room with them in my pajamas. So it's just a different dynamic where you feel a lot more comfortable. And it was a little bit more intimidating because I'm asking them kind of about myself and how their thought process was. And I'm not trying to make the episode all about talking about Jefferson, but at the same time, people are curious of like, how are your parents? And so it was an opportunity for me to honor them. And I know I talk about my dad because I have a lot of his mannerisms, and like he's very diplomatic and very slow to speak, quick to listen kind of thing. But my mother is incredibly kind. My dad's nice too. Don't get me wrong. My mother is very kind. And so she was the type that if I had a problem with somebody at school and complaining about it, she'd go, well, were you kind? And I said, well, Mama, you don't understand. They did X, Y, and Z. And she would just say, well, I think you should be kind. Like, doesn't matter what they did. There's always the room for kindness. So she just spent a lot of time with me being such a nurturer, and she's a wonderful mom. I'm the oldest of 4. And I think that's the reason why we have a really very strong relationship, or the standards that they set.
You mentioned your dad like tearing up, and that like triggered some emotion in you. What was a specific moment from the podcast where, you felt yourself on the verge of tears because of something good that was shared from your parents?
Yeah. So my dad there were several times where I was trying to hold it together, but there was a specific time where Dad was talking about nighttime prayers and stories. And he would sit on the edge of my bed and he'd make up a story. And as a trial attorney, wonderful storyteller. Like he could put you right in that place. And it all became so vivid the way he would tell a story. And he would always make me the hero. Some Prince Jefferson going to save Queen Shirley or Princess Shirley, which was my mother's name. And so it would always kind of set me up as saving the day. And I would you're just a kid. It feels amazing. It felt special. And it just felt so nostalgic. Like I could put myself there. I could feel the bed sheets. I could see my bedroom. And it doesn't feel that long ago, Doug. It just doesn't feel that long ago. And now I'm doing the same thing with my kids at the same age. And, I was looking through old pictures of my parents and seeing me the same age of my kids and just going, geez, where has the time gone? And it's still their first time to be parents. And that's just a really hard thing to go around mentally. And I start to see myself in my parents. I start to do things. I'm like, oh my gosh, that is my dad. My sister says something. I'm like, oh my gosh, that is Mom. And it's a funny way the world works, but it's a very special way too.
You have this amazing gift at communicating difficult topics to your audience, and you're a great, storyteller yourself. Do you think that a big part of your ability to have difficult conversations and convey difficult topics is because your dad modeled that for you, and your mom with kindness growing up?
Yeah, I think that certainly was a big part of it, of seeing the standard that they set in the way they treated each other, the way they handled arguments in the house, the way my dad would, when I had problems, he would probe why or so. And I say so, I mean, like I would bring something to him and he'd go, so? Like, in other words, the excuse was never the issue. So he was great at peeling back the layers of however I was feeling about something. And big motivator. Another that I give full credit to is just it's a gift. It's a spiritual gift that my parents prayed for in my life to give me wisdom and charisma and to be able to be what they wanted me to be in the world, and a way that I could live in his purpose. And so I find that it is my joy to use a gift. I mean, don't ask me to do economics. Don't ask me to build you a birdhouse. I'm the wrong guy. But when it comes to words and communication and the videos that I make, I have no explanation. I don't script any of my videos out. I don't Google any of my topics before I talk. I just give them my tips. And so there's just some part of it that I really have no good explanation other than to say it's a gift that it is truly my joy and responsibility to share.
That's awesome, man. So beautifully said. Shifting back a little bit, like if somebody is entering a conversation with somebody and they want it to go as horrible as possible, what would they do?
If they wanted to go as horrible as possible?
Yeah, just to try to point people away from what they like really, really shouldn't do.
One would be to use extremes. That's the always and nevers. You always do that. Two would be beginning the word with you, even in the little things. Like you would say that. And what does that mean? What are you talking about there? So using the word you, very defensive. Using extremes like the always and never, all it does is just guarantee you're going to have another conversation about whether you always or never do the thing. And then three would probably be beginning your question with why. Why'd you do that? Why would I? Why would you? As soon as you ask why, it becomes very confrontational. People take it very accusatory and assume that you're trying to undermine their autonomy. And we don't like that because we want to respond. Why? Because I said so. That's why. Because I wanted to. That's why. It's the same thing when somebody says you can't do that. What's the number one thing you want to do? Prove to them that you can. And so these are just elements that there's lots of different ways a conversation can go south in a hurry. Of course, you can use offensive language, be vulgar, say terrible things, name call, toxic stuff. Take all that aside. The very small little minor things are using you as your first sentence, beginning a question with why, and using extremes where you don't need them.
Yeah, and I know you talk about like self-assurance as being a way to productive conversations, and when people lack that, like you talked about at the beginning, like when you're kind of like fumbling your words and you're not clear, conversations can fall flat, right? But I think people oftentimes they think standing up for themselves is confrontational. What do you believe about that, and how can people like embrace actually speaking their mind?
Well, there's the theme of understanding what you have to say is worth saying. There are people who just don't think that their words are that important, or what they have to share is really worth hearing. And that's just not true. It's a lie that they're telling themselves. The second would be the mindset of when it comes to standing your ground, not everybody is worth getting out of your chair for. So if you have to stand your ground against every single person who disagrees with you, and you feel like you have to, like if you've been in those conversations, I have a friend of mine who, if I disagree with him at any point, like he raises to 120%. Like, really, dude? That's what you think? Like, hey man, we're just talking. Every time, if you want to make a battle out of everything, that's going to be the default that everybody knows you to be. And that just means your buttons are exposed. Anybody can come and push a button of yours. And that means you really have no control, meaning you have no confidence in yourself. So it's the one, understanding you have something to share. Two, not everybody's worth getting out of your chair for. If they don't mean something to you, if they don't matter, if the conversation doesn't matter, just because they throw a pitch doesn't mean you got to swing. Just let it go by. It's a ball. Let it go. You don't need to swing at it. And then the other would be to understand that there are people out there that when it comes to the difficult stuff, that they're just not going to be your person. When you want to stand your ground, it is not only knowing you have the ability within yourself, but it's also stop undercutting your words. So that means removing things like, this is probably a dumb question, but you probably know better than me. Or I could be wrong about this. By the way, anybody who starts with, I could be wrong about this, never thinks they're wrong. I hate to bother you. Like, all you're doing is just telling them that you're bothering them. All you're doing is telling them you're about to ask a dumb question. remove all of that. You don't need it. You just need to start with your point of what you want to say.
What about like the other side of that? You mentioned like you have a buddy that, goes 0 to 100. There's some people that go from 0 to 0 and they're just cold, shut down. And that could when you're trying to express yourself to somebody. I mean, that's like top of the list of what I think irritates a lot of people is when they feel like that person isn't listening to them. I mean, I know like poking and trying to pry that person to open up isn't necessarily the solution, but how can people navigate that?
That's hard because everybody has a tolerance. There are people that are, let's say, neurodivergent. There are people that can't read emotions very well. They don't know how to process those emotions very well. They're not sure what to do with them. So if you start forcing them on how they should feel and how they should think, and I want to feel like you understood me, that can cause problems. There are ways that I'd say you could frame the conversation or you can ask the question of, should I read into that silence? Like, should I read into that? Did you mean? So like, let's say if you're texting with somebody and all of a sudden they start sending some very short responses back. If you just, instead of going, okay, you know what, you do you, you know what, forget it. Let's assume it was bad intent. If you just ask the question, you text back, are you meaning to be short? Did you mean that to sound short? I mean, you are just asking these questions to calibrate the idea of, I am perceiving something from you and I don't know if that's the truth. So I'm going to give you the grace to correct me. That's a whole lot better than telling them, you're being so short. Why are you being so quiet? Like, they're not going to want to open up. Whenever you say something like, what's wrong? What you're telling them is how you're feeling right now is wrong. When truly there could be nothing wrong. Like, how they're feeling is a totally normal feeling. Even if they are being quiet, that's a totally normal response. Everybody has different layers as to what their baseline is. We all come in with different defaults.
I've seen something lately where people will kind of act like the other person to show them how they are treating them and hoping to get a reaction. So for instance, if you and I were texting and I'm like, yo, bro, like hope the book launch is going well. How are things? And you're like, give me like you liked the message. You know what I mean? Like a thumbs up. You didn't even give me. I'm like, dang, Jefferson's mad. And then like you come back to me and you're like, hey man, like how's it going? I haven't heard from you in a while. And I just give you the thumbs up and you're like, dude, what the heck? Is that, I mean, I would imagine that's a pretty immature way of handling it, right?
Yeah, isn't that funny how it just a thumbs up, but how he reads so much into it? Yeah, I mean, a thumbs up now in our world right now is one of the most passive things you can do. Now, I feel like it's okay in the business context. Like if you're not talking with a real friend, but you're just like, yep, got it, cool, sounds good. If somebody texts, hey, we're at this restaurant, thumbs up, got it. But if the prompt is for real meaningful discussion and you just like it, or even you heart it, or whatever, like it is only informing them of, I think, so little of this conversation that I can't give the time to move my thumb 2 centimeters to use actual pixels that represent words. It is like the ultimate laziness, in my opinion. So it is, I love emojis. Emojis are great because it gives some context for things. It helps give a little bit more emotional nuance into the conversation. But yeah, if the prompt is for real genuine conversation and they just give it a thumbs up, that's bad stuff. I mean, if you need to follow up with, you mad? You good? I feel if that happened, if you did that to me, I would respond with, you good? All good? Like, oh yeah, no, all good. I'm just, I'm in the middle of whatever, running this errand. So you also want to kind of give them the grace to not take it too personally.
Yeah, I think it can be useful. Like if you're communicating with somebody, you're like, hey, I'm on my way. I'll be there in 10. You give them like a thumbs up, but you don't have to like go into like, oh, like what road are you on? Like, what are you seeing on the sidewalk?
Yeah, exactly. Or it's what I will often do is I will tell them, not ignoring you, running through this errand. I'll call you, text you in a little bit, text you later today. Like if I can just let them know I've seen it, I'm not ignoring you. This is, even if it's the next day, I'll still say, not ignoring this. trying to get to a point where I can wrap my head around it or whatever. It's just acknowledging, like, it's just that feeling of, can you please let me know at all that you heard me, that I'm not just speaking into nothing?
Well, I saw a funny meme today that was like, when my wife calls me by my actual name, I might as well have the divorce papers because I know she's mad or something. It was kind of very similar to like giving you a thumbs up on like an initial message.
Yeah. That's exactly right. Yeah. You just know, that's like getting, we need to talk, period. You're like, well, okay, I guess I'll better pick out my gravestone because I did something terrible. That's how it feels.
Well, Jefferson, this has been awesome. I could talk to you for hours, man.
Same.
Loved our conversation. Is there anything else you would like to share regarding what we've talked about, stuff in the book that you think the audience would appreciate?
The only thing I would share is that the whole point of communication and my mission in the world and what's part of my book is that it doesn't matter what you said in the last conversation. It doesn't matter what you've said in the past, that you can truly change it all with simply what you choose to say next. And that you can really make it a better world with just one conversation at a time. You really can, no matter where you want to be.
Love it, brother. Well, thanks again for coming on the show. If people want to buy the book, if they are not following you, which everybody definitely should follow Jefferson on social media, where can they do that?
Yeah, so my main account that I use is Instagram, but they can find me on Facebook or TikTok, LinkedIn. And the book is called The Next Conversation. I have a link on my website, jeffersonfisher.com/book, where you can see all the retailers, including the audiobook, if my voice has not been completely off-putting to you by now, and has all the retailers, including international editions. But of course, you can find it on the main ones that you can prime, back to you in 2 days and all that. So all great. I appreciate it, Doug. It's great to catch up again, man.
Likewise, man. I got to say this, and I mean this from the heart. There's not many conversations I love the podcast and I love interviewing people, but when I chatted with you like the first time, and I wanted to, to re-listen to that conversation to help myself get better as a human and get better at communicating. And even on social media, you're somebody that when, your stuff pops up, I definitely tune in because I just think what you share is really amazing. It's from the heart, and you have a great way of conveying it in a way that is really digestible for people.
Appreciate it, Doug. That means a lot to me, man. Really. Thank you. Love our conversations. Glad to hear everything's going well up in Baltimore, brother.
You got it, man.
Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, I really think you're going to like this video as well. I'll see you there.